So after last video, art can be good in more than one way, and I'd recommend checking that out before watching this video, just so you know, have the backdrop for what we're going to talk about today. There's a lot of interest in examples or of the morally good category or the morally sound category, and this is a hard question, and I was kind of reluctant to attack it or try to see what I could do with it, but I'm going to give it a shot. Because and part of the reason why it is difficult is, first off, it is ultimately something you have to decide for yourself. It's like nobody else can morally evaluate a text for you, at least to a degree. It's like people can give you guidance, and especially when you're learning or figuring things out. But ultimately, morality is a decision you have to make for yourself, and you have to figure it out for yourself. Even when you receive help from others to learn how to think morally, and you may subscribe to, you may listen to people and they might give you good ideas, things like that. But it doesn't necessarily, but morality is ultimately going to be a personal choice and a personal belief. You have to believe it yourself for it to really function, so to speak. So that's kind of the difficulty, and why the question of identifying or giving examples of art or literature that is morally sound is so difficult, is because ultimately you have to decide what is morally sound. But it did occur to me I could discuss at least some ways, some ways to think about the problem, or at least some ways I think about the problem in any case. And give like some half examples, because it's hard to give examples because it is we'll get into a bit of why with the subjectivity part that we'll talk about later. But overall, I want to give at least as much information as I can, and maybe give it's like I can't answer the question, but I want to at least open the door, so to speak, kind of give you some landmarks, give you some orientation on how you could approach the issue, because it does matter. So yeah. To start off, the morally sound category, I think of it in terms of you've got a baseline in the category, so something that is just morally sound, or morally even it might even be correct to describe as morally neutral, and then you have something that is morally excellent. So something that's at the baseline, so that's kind of morally neutral, would be something that doesn't really encourage you to be worse than you are. It doesn't hurt your morality. It doesn't hurt you. It doesn't make you want to hurt yourself or hurt somebody else, or you think less of yourself or anything like that. So that would kind of be like the baseline, where it's not really affecting you morally in any way. It doesn't increase your desire or capacity or tendency to harm anyone, including yourself. So that's kind of like the neutral point. So that would be the very bottom of the category. Something that does encourage you to hurt yourself or others would obviously would pretty naturally be morally unsound. And that can be more subtle than you might think, but there are different ways that can happen. But yeah, that's kind of the baseline, is if it's not really hurting you or anyone else. But moral excellence is kind of, I'd say, at the top of the category, and that would be things that encourage you to be better than you are. So unlike the baseline, which I would say doesn't ever make you think less of yourself, sometimes morally excellent texts may actually make you feel worse about yourself, but only insofar as they're enabling you to grow, and to become a better person. So they might help you identify your faults, and then also help you feel the capacity to correct those faults. So something like that. But not everything is going to have that specific dynamic. Just something that makes you feel capable of bettering yourself or the world and things like that. That energizes you to do good things. So in terms of getting to moral excellence, I would say that literature has an advantage, or at least anything that has a story or a narrative, or a text. I think they have an easier time getting to moral excellence than, say, a painting, visual arts, just because there's more communication going on. I'd say art is also easier for it to be baseline. It's harder for art to hurt you like visual art to hurt you than it is for a text to tell you to do something bad. So that's just a point where visual arts versus narrative arts or literature might differ in this category in terms of whether they're more likely to be baseline or excellent. But just as some example, like some things that for me at least I would consider to be morally excellent art would be Frederick Edwin Church. He was a painter from the, I believe, 1800s, who did a lot of paintings in Latin America. That I might talk a little bit about why that in a bit. But you also have, like, you might contrast that with Escher, who's famous for his paradoxical art. That would probably be a good example of baseline moral art, because, like, when you look at the crazy stairways that Escher drew, they don't really interact with you morally. They don't make you feel better or worse about the world. They just make you feel funky, and that's not a bad thing. It's like there's definitely a space for like morally neutral stuff, because there's a lot of stuff that doesn't. It's like there's a lot of wonder and things to experience that don't really affect you morally. And so that's not a problem. It's not a problem that Escher's staircases or paradoxes don't reach moral excellence. They've got plenty of other excellence, other good in them. And they're at least morally neutral. They're not harming anyone. So with that out of the way, the baseline and versus excellence, and kind of like there's a whole range between that, and it can be complicated. But I just wanted to get into some of the issues with in the issues in determining which texts are morally sound and which are not, because it's hard, and it's not necessarily something where I feel it's very productive to categorically define a piece of media as morally sound or morally unsound, because typically most texts are going to have elements. Like no text is morally perfect, for one. No human is morally perfect, and morally imperfect humans cannot produce morally perfect texts. So yeah, it's like like our own imperfection is going to translate into the text. And that's also true for aesthetics and technical skill as well. There doesn't exist an aesthetically perfect or a technically perfect text or art piece. Like if you really want to dig into it, or if you want to scrutinize it, so to speak. So there's always going to be some degree of imperfection, just because it's like morality is complex and you can't ever capture all the nuance in a single text. That's just not possible, and it wouldn't be a good thing to try to reduce morality to such simplicity either. But you also have issues of like it's hard to define a text in terms of morality, because you can also have over the span of a text, like a book, like a novel, it's like you could have very excellent parts, you could have very ambiguous parts or neutral parts, and you could also have bad parts. And it's like deciding, like, how do you aggregate that? Because I don't know that there really is a good way to aggregate that. Because it's like if a book has redeeming parts, they may be very redeeming, or if a book has very bad parts, they may ruin the whole thing. So it's hard to especially describe a text that isn't like any complex text, any long text. It's going to be hard to classify it as simply morally good or morally sound. It may be predominantly, but usually it's not. I don't know. I don't generally find it productive to try to describe a whole piece of media as being morally sound, because even if a whole text, even if on the whole it is a very good text and it does inspire you and help you be a wonderful person, there may be parts that, like if you endorse the whole thing as being moral, you may overlook some ways that the text might be influencing you negatively, or areas in which the text is unsophisticated, where its morality is, so to speak, reductive or flawed, something like that. And one thing I just hinted at before was that more so that I'd say than the aesthetically pleasing or the technical skill categories, I'd say moral soundness is very vulnerable to spoilage. Like something that is very morally corrupt or unsound in a text or in an art piece can ruin the whole thing in a way that, typically speaking, things that are aesthetically poor or technically unskilled aren't going to damage the character of the whole piece necessarily in the same way. Like all three categories, you can have spoilers, spoilage, not like story spoilers, but like something ruining the whole, like one part ruining the whole, spoiler, that kind of spoiling. But so it's like all three categories are vulnerable to that, but yeah, all three categories are vulnerable to that. But I would say moral soundness may be extra vulnerable to spoilage. But even then, not every, the existence of something that is morally flawed doesn't mean it's a spoiler, like that it's ruining the whole piece either. It may be an acceptable error. It may be a good faith disagreement. It's like there's a lot of room to disagree over morality. So just because somebody arrives at a different moral conclusion from you doesn't necessarily mean that their text is morally invalid. As long as, especially if they arrived at it in good faith and are genuinely concerned with arriving at, developing a moral viewpoint of the world. Just an example of that, it's like, I would say, like The Little Prince, the novella, wonderful little book designated for children, but the ending is kind of, I don't agree. I have problems with the ending, which if you're familiar with it, I won't dig into it here, but that would just be an example. And if you haven't read The Little Prince, go read it. It's like 40 pages. It's a short book. You can read it in a day, less than in an hour or two, probably. It's been a while, so maybe my estimate's off, but it's worth reading. Very worth reading. So yeah. And just to get to kind of cap off this discussion, this part of the discussion is like, I would compare Don Quixote Book 1 and Don Quixote Book 2. I'd say they have very different moral qualities. I'd say Book 2 is much stronger in terms of its morality and its moral sense of the world than Book 1 is. Because Book 1 tends to be a bit frivolous, whereas Book 2 tends to take things more seriously, which things don't necessarily have to take things seriously to be moral. But when something serious is happening, it should be taken seriously. So the second thing that makes defining these things difficult or defining a text as morally sound, is good intentions don't necessarily suffice, or just having like the ideas right. Because there are texts that like condemn bad things, but the way they depict those bad things is itself kind of problematic. So this is especially common for things like graphic violence, trauma, and you can guess at some other related stuff, because those can undermine a piece and kind of like damage a text message. Like the method of depicting something serious can undermine the message, even if the intentions are good, or even if the message overall is correct. This could be, for instance, when you can have a text that like says murder is wrong, but the way it depicts murder is just in bad taste. Like it's disgusting. It may be like trying to profit off of the depiction of violence through shock value, for instance. So method matters. Another difficulty is just the fact that morality it's not vague, but it is disputed. Morality, there's a lot of disagreement about what counts as moral, and that's a difficult discussion. I try to not be too harsh on this front, or at least sometimes. There are certain moral flaws that I do come down on pretty hard, but like in a text, but overall, it's like I wouldn't recommend being too strict on this front. Because it's like, in terms of moral disputes, there's a lot of room for disagreement, and I don't think that's a bad thing. Especially because a lot of those disagreements come from trying to react to different situations. So it's like we develop different moral principles and we live under those moral principles, but we don't necessarily realize that we've designed, like, our moral principles are better tuned to the circumstances we live in and may not necessarily work as well for someone else. Some things like that. And that kind of leads into one of the most important issues, which is just subjectivity. Even when the morality is not disputed, like things like murder. Like murder is wrong. Like don't just kill people for fun. That's an easy one. That's not morally disputed. But if a text argues, but just because like a murder is depicted doesn't necessarily mean you know. Like unless the author comes out and says exactly what they mean, you don't necessarily know what they want to say. We tend to, and our interpretation is always going to be very important in determining what we take away from a text. So no matter what an author writes, different people are going to evaluate it differently and have different moral experiences of that text. So, and sometimes those interpretations will be completely off the rocker and like unfounded. But even within, but sometimes even like between different reasonable interpretations of a text, one will be morally sound and another will be morally unsound. And in that case, it's kind of it's like you can't, for the people who do get a moral benefit out of the text, good for them, and that's wonderful. For the people who don't, then like that's not like a bad thing on their part either. Just because they experience a text in a way where they do not, where the text hurts them, like that's not like an evil thing on their part, unless they're like willfully misinterpreting it or something. In which case they probably shouldn't be doing that. And they shouldn't be you shouldn't, like if you're having a very subjective experience of a text, like your experience of a text is very specific to you, and very personal, that experience matters. And you probably shouldn't use that as a basis to classify the text as morally good or morally ungood, to other people when you're talking to other people. Anyway, because you may be able to speak to how it affects you. But if it is a very personal experience, your experience may not be shared, which isn't an evil thing, not an evil thing at all. That's just how it works. And then one of the last complications is the fact that, or the last complication that I wanted to mention is that sometimes it's not clear to the very end whether a text is morally good or morally bad, because endings matter. Endings can cause you to reinterpret, endings often set the mood for the whole text, especially for complicated texts or texts with very difficult moral issues. It's really hard to know how you feel about it until you get to the end. So that can make it very difficult to evaluate whether something is morally sound or not, especially because sometimes you may not have the stomach to get through it, and that's not a bad thing either. Like if a text puts you off or you find it morally repugnant for the majority of it, even if the ending is good, it may be too much to ask of you to get to that ending and to see the payoff. If you know there's going to be catharsis, if you know there's going to be a payoff when you get to the end, then it may be worth it, as long as it's not too much effort. But it also depends on how much effort that's going to be. So yeah. Endings can cause can flip the whole thing on its head. I've had experiences where there was a text where I was like really vibing with it, and I thought like it was morally sound, and then the ending hits, and it causes you to reinterpret the whole thing, and it kind of undermines its own message and kind of like turns it into something that's just kind of disappointing or disillusioning. On the other hand, you can have something that I don't think I've ever had a text where I was like, this is bad most of the time, and then the ending fixed it. I've never had that experience, but I have had plenty of experiences where something was on the line, like on the edge. It's like I wasn't sure if I vibed with it, so to speak, morally, if it had good vibes. I wasn't sure until the ending where like the vibe settled and it was like, yes, this is good. But I've also had plenty of experiences where something was all along the line and it ended up being just bad. So those line cases are really hard. And you ultimately just do have to decide for yourself how you feel about those. And I guess as some final recommendations is, if you do really want to engage with a text that I would think is probably a safe bet for being morally sound for pretty much anyone, I would recommend something like the novel Les Miserables. I don't necessarily the play is decent, the movie's decent, but the novel is it's a harder text. It's a lot more complicated than the play or the film. but it is very rich in terms of its discussions and of justice, of kindness, of mercy, of self-improvement and repentance. Very good book. Very good book. Les Miserables is like almost flawless. It would probably like it's fantastic. Another book would be yeah, like Dostoevsky has some good stuff. Pro and Contra, book 5 of the Brothers Karamazov, Pro and Contra. I can recommend that one pretty well. But you'll also notice that these texts are like Les Miserables and the Brothers Karamazov are also very high on the academic or textual skill, technical skill category. So, and they're not necessarily easy texts to read. So they may not be your best choice. But maybe even in like some more more popular examples. I mean, I'm a bit of a niche person, so what I like is not necessarily popular, but it's modern at least. The original series of like Avatar: The Last Airbender is pretty good. It's like it's pretty morally consistent. Like a lot of honestly, a lot of stories that are directed at kids. Or like half directed, like they're directed at children, but they're not directed exclusively at children, if you get me. There's actually a lot of good stuff in that space. I enjoy good JRPG, or kind of like young adult kind of targeted fiction. Because it's like it's often still got like a very nice sense of nobility and idealism, that you can kind of just not worry about. Because that's the thing with a lot of stuff where it's like even when it's hard to recommend morally like texts as morally sound because I interpret them as morally sound because of my experience of the text. And when we get into like texts that are discussing complex moral issues, you could have a totally different experience of it. So it's like some of the foreign films I've watched that like did influence my morality quite a bit, and like I felt like were very elucidating. I wouldn't necessarily recommend them as being morally sound because you could have, like, it would be really easy to have a very bad experience with them as well. So especially when you get into the more complex stuff, generally speaking, it's hard. It's not cut and dry whether you'll experience it as morally sound or not, which is why like texts like Les Miserables are so fascinating because they are very complex and sophisticated, and they still manage to produce a pretty coherent and very defensible moral vision. So this ended up being pretty long, which I guess is probably to be expected. This is a hard topic. But yeah, hopefully this gives you some stuff to think about anyway. You don't need to think about it all the time either. This is way too much to think about for every single story you interact with. It's totally fine for a story or for a piece of art, for you to just experience it and for it to be light and fluffy and chill. And especially like a lot of stuff is, as I mentioned, just morally neutral. And if it's morally neutral, you don't need to spend time thinking about it. But I do encourage everybody to like, to engage with morally complex texts because it's worthwhile to develop your sense of morality. It's something we need to study. Like morality doesn't just pop out of the ground fully formed. It's like any other thing where you have to study, you have to practice, and you have to figure things out. And unlike studying, say, mathematics or psychology or philosophy or what have you, studying morality is guaranteed to be practical. Because it helps you interact with the people around you better and to help them and help yourself have a better life, which is always great. That's always a good thing. And that's why I take the morally sound category so seriously, is because I do want to figure out what is moral and what isn't. And even though it's hard, and even though there's a lot of disagreement about what is and is not moral, there's a lot of room for improvement and for a lot of room for learning. Even if sometimes you have to just guess what is moral and you can't be sure. Even if you're guessing, if you're trying and studying and practicing, you do grow in terms of morality, and that's a good experience, a wonderful experience, because you make your own life more wonderful and you make the life of others more wonderful, and that's a good thing. And that's just as true, and that's very much a part of our literature. There's a lot of moral literature, wonderfully moral literature, even if it isn't about morality. Like, it just invites you to view the world in a more rich way. And to just finish this off, I mentioned Frederick Edwin Church earlier, and I'm going to just explain why. It's like Frederick Edwin Church, like he's a painter. He's not producing anything that tells you to believe anything or to do anything. But at least when I view the paintings, this may be very subjective, but when I view a painting like The Heart of the Andes, it just has an appreciation for creation and for human, and for this like simple human folk, that I find very ennobling and very moving. So I'll put some links to those to some of Frederick Edwin Church's paintings in the description, just so y'all can give them a look. And you may not experience the same thing that I do from it, but there is a lot that can just connect you to the good in the world and the good in other people and the good in yourself. And that's always worth seeking. So take care, and see y'all on the flip side. Au revoir.